In 1960, at the very peak of her fame, Brigitte Bardot was taken to the hospital after an attempt to end her own life. Deep cuts on her wrists, an overdose of sleeping pills. It wasn't because a role had failed, nor because her career was slipping. The bitter irony was that this happened at the very moment she was being celebrated as the most desired woman on the planet, an icon of freedom, sexuality, and the new vitality of post-war Europe. The incident did not make the public step back. It only made the cameras move in closer. Only a few years earlier, Bardot had shaken cinema with "And God Created Woman," a young woman who didn't ask permission to desire, who felt no shame in her longing, who refused to stand still inside old moral templates. That image was praised as a revolution for women, but for Bardot herself, it quickly became an invisible cage. Her acting talent was eclipsed by her body. The person was swallowed by the symbol. Every step she took in real life was read as the next scene in an ongoing film. Fame did not bring control. It brought pursuit. Paparazzi followed her every breath, every affair, every collapse. Roles kept coming, but the sense of emptiness grew sharper by the day. Bardot did not fall apart in failure. She was exhausted by success. Brigitte Bardot's story is not a journey from poverty to glory. It is a violent collision between talent and the price of becoming a symbol. Too early and far beyond what a human being can endure. Exhaustion did not arrive all at once. It had been accumulating from very early on, long before Brigitte Bardot ever knew stage lights or applause. To understand why an image once associated with freedom became so closely tied to prolonged withdrawals and disappearances, you have to return to her earliest years, where discipline came before tenderness, and private emotion was not something anyone considered worth protecting. Brigitte Anne-Marie Bardot was born on September 28, 1934, in Paris's 15th arrondissement. Her family belonged to a conservative middle-class world. Her father, Louis Bardot, an industrial engineer, valued order and honor above all else. Her mother, Anne-Marie Moussel, from a bourgeois background, imposed standards of behavior and physical presentation on her daughter from an early age. Bardot was the first child. 4 years later, the family welcomed a second daughter, Marie-Jeanne, who would later become known by the stage name Mijanou. Within that family structure, Brigitte was required early on to be right, to be proper, to be controlled. Her childhood was not marked by material hardship, but emotional closeness was almost absent. Affectionate gestures were rare. Praise was not a familiar language. Bardot's young body was watched, corrected, shaped. Everything from posture to the way she walked, even the expressions on her face. In that home, maintaining appearances mattered more than expressing feelings. Music and ballet entered her life early, not as a form of release, but as an extension of discipline. Bardot was placed in dance classes as a child, not to free herself, but to achieve physical precision. Long training sessions and strict rules about stance, gaze, and breathing gave her extraordinary control over her body. At the same time, they created an ever-widening distance between her body and any sense of inner safety. She studied at Lycée La Fontaine, an elite girls' school in Paris, yet never truly felt integrated. Her world slowly narrowed into the rehearsal room, where every movement was measured and judged. From 1947 onward, she was placed in rigorous ballet training, then enrolled at the Conservatoire de Paris under the instruction of Boris Kniazev. Ballet allows no deviation. It demands balance. Holding your breath at the right moment, standing upright even when exhausted. But it offers no language for processing emotion. It was during this period, when Bardot was only 15, that the pressure drove her to attempt suicide. an attempt that failed. This act was not tied to a single isolated shock, but rather the outcome of prolonged depression, suffocation, isolation, and a sense of having no exit within her environment. After that incident, the family almost never mentioned it again. There was no meaningful psychological treatment, no explanation. Everything was sealed shut with silence. Bardot returned to school, returned to the studio, continued meeting the same demands as if nothing had happened. Life was pushed back into its old shape. But from that point on, disappearing was no longer a distant thought. It existed as a possibility, long before the public ever began calling her presence freedom. After that early rupture, Bardot did not step into public life through any clear, deliberate choice. It unfolded along a different trajectory. Her body moved first, and the person followed behind. In 1949, when she was only 15, she appeared on the cover of Elle, a quiet image, yet one with an unusual weight. No elaborate pose, no accompanying story. Just a face, a young body, and a nameless sensation that made it impossible to look away. From that moment on, Bardot no longer belonged only to the private spaces of a studio or a classroom. She crossed into another zone, one where an image could be consumed faster than the person inside. It could even become fully aware of what it meant. Fashion opened the door before cinema did. Photo shoots began to happen regularly, the directions minimal but the demand unmistakable. Stand on the right axis and let the light do the rest. Ballet had trained Bardot in absolute physical control. Now that very control made her easy to watch in a way that was almost unsettling. The body did not resist. The gaze did not flinch. Her presence was strong enough for the frame to complete itself without needing further explanation. Those early images quickly pushed Bardot into a phase of constant work, yet with no clear sense of direction. In 1952, Manina, La Fille Sans Voile, appeared just as she turned 18. The role barely required inner life in the conventional sense. The camera placed Bardot against sea and sunlight, against the slow movements of a young body, and let her presence function in place of psychological development. The film did not need her to act through classical dramatic structure. It needed a body new enough, different enough, to disrupt the familiar rhythm of post-war French cinema. That difference was recognized immediately, but in an ambiguous way. She drew attention, but she was not yet trusted. In the years that followed, Bardot worked steadily inside a logic that did not allow real choice. Scripts came and went, small roles, supporting roles, roles remembered more for the image than for the action. She was not placed among the serious actresses, nor was she given the authority to shape her characters. On set, demands always revolved around placement, tempo, the openness of gesture, things the body could deliver instantly, while emotion was kept aside as something unnecessary. French cinema at the time did not yet know what kind of story to tell through Bardot. It only knew that when she appeared, the temperature of the frame changed. The pressure of this period did not come from public failure, but from the repetition of a nameless function. Bardot worked in a state of being tested rather than built, where each film was another measurement of the same question. How far could this body go before it was sealed into a fixed form? Modest box office, no major nominations, no formal recognition, yet attention accumulated quietly. Bardot was not yet a star, not yet someone with an image she could lean on. She had only a body repeatedly placed at the center without being granted meaning, a silent foreign object inside a classical structure, waiting for the next crack to appear. That ambiguity ended abruptly in 1956, when Et Dieu, Créa la Femme was released. From the instant Juliette Hardy entered the frame, the old rules tilted. Bardot did not play a rebellious young woman through familiar psychological logic. She arrived as a spontaneous force of life, operating through rhythm, through body, gaze, movement that refused adjustment. The camera did not guide her. It was forced to keep up. What audiences saw was not a carefully constructed character, but the feeling of loss of control spreading from the frame into the theater. The reaction was almost immediate and violently polarized. In the United States and several other countries, the film was banned or forced into cuts, condemned for presenting female sexuality without permission, without softening, without any moral justification. Critics split sharply. One side saw Bardot as a symbol of decadence that needed to be restrained. The other saw in her a form of instinctive liberation that popular cinema had never allowed. The debate did not revolve around acting. It revolved around a far more dangerous question: who had the right to define a woman's body, and within what limits? That backlash triggered the opposite effect in the international marketplace. Box office numbers exploded. European and American media began naming Bardot as something larger than cinema itself. After only one film, she became the most globally recognizable French woman, not through awards or official cultural institutions, but through the contagious power of an image that made society uneasy simply by existing. Even French cinema, the place that had produced the film, could no longer control how Bardot was seen, interpreted, and used. From that point forward, control slipped out of Bardot's hands. Her career was no longer decided by the roles she chose, but by how the public interpreted her body. Bardot stopped being seen as an actress finding her place. She was pushed into the role of a social phenomenon, where every appearance was read as a statement, every movement amplified into a message. That global explosion created fame on an unprecedented scale, while also laying the foundation for a long sequence of collisions between the real person and an image that no longer belonged to her alone. The 1956 explosion forced cinema to try to reset Bardot, placing her back into more familiar, safer molds. In 1957, Une Parisienne attempted to steer her into the Hollywood-style romantic comedy orbit. Light, charming, lovable, without causing unease. But that was precisely where the mismatch became obvious. Bardot did not operate on the safe rhythm of witty dialogue or neat situations. Her presence made scenes designed to be cute turn tense, as if her body refused to serve as a harmless illustration. The film did not collapse disastrously, but it revealed something difficult to hide. Bardot did not fit the softened, mass-consumable female lead. By 1958, Hollywood tried again with the female. The American system approached Bardot through the tight discipline of the studio machine, yet it did not know where to place her inside that structure. The role was flattened, pulled toward symbolism, rather than allowed to move freely. What had once created Bardot's magnetism was treated as uncontrollable. Her strangeness was not exploited. It was compressed, producing a constant sense of off-rhythm between the person and the production mechanism. Bardot left the experience with the impression that here, she was an object to be managed rather than an energy to be listened to. In 1959, Bardot returned to France with Babette Goes to War. Audiences responded warmly, box office numbers were strong, and Bardot's image continued to dominate the public sphere. Yet inside that success, a quiet resistance began to form. Roles that repeated the same version of herself, playful, sensual, easily readable, started to feel exhausting. The public's affection no longer aligned with the feeling of the woman standing in front of the camera. And in the middle of that embrace, Bardot began to push back, looking for a way out of the repetition that was tightening around her career. That quiet resistance, accumulating through the late 1950s, carried Bardot into La Vérité in 1960 as an attempt at self-redefinition. The role of Dominique Marceau placed her in the heaviest zone of tragedy. a woman judged not only by the law, but by the collective moral gaze. Here, the body was no longer the thing that disturbed the atmosphere. It became evidence. Bardot let the character exist in a state of constant tension, where pain did not need melodramatic peaks, but leaked out through exhaustion, defensiveness, a gaze closing tighter with each layer of accusation. It was one of the rare times she deliberately chose a role demanding psychological burden instead of exploiting the biological presence that had built her fame. The way Bardot stayed with the character revealed a clear determination to prove she could act pain, carry tragedy, and exist on screen without relying on sexuality. Critics recognized the effort, viewing La Vérité as a serious advance in her acting work, yet the public response barely shifted. Dominique Marceau was still read through the same lens, formed in 1956. What was built through performance was quickly pulled back into the familiar image. Bardot, as a controversial symbol, as an arousing body rather than a tragic character. That gap exposed a rigid limit. The failure was not in the role, but in a reception structure that had already fixed how one human being was allowed to be seen. Bardot could change how she appeared before the camera, but the gaze aimed at her continued to run on old momentum. From there, Bardot entered the early 1960s in a fundamentally different condition. She was no longer evaluated film by film, but treated as an object of cultural commentary. Every appearance was dragged into debates beyond cinema: morality, sexuality, freedom, degeneration versus liberation. Two opposing poles could coexist, but both rested on the same premise. The image of Bardot mattered more than the real person. Her career therefore slipped out of the normal logic of role selection and moved into a space where she herself became a surface onto which society projected its arguments with itself. Le Mépris in 1963 pushed that condition into full visibility. Bardot in the film was not constructed as a character to be understood, but as an image to be consumed and fragmented. The opening nude scene does not invite pleasure. It is cold, detached, mechanical, dividing the body into parts under the camera's measuring gaze. Bardot appears there not to seduce, but to expose the way cinema calculates, assigns value to, and uses the female body. The role does not free her from the symbol, but it turns that symbol into a surface that reveals the power of the gaze itself. If La Vérité was an attempt to step outside the sealed frame, then Le Mépris showed that the frame was not rooted in personal choice, but in the machinery of production and image consumption. Bardot moved from trying to prove her acting ability to being placed in the position of illustrating how cinema looks at women. That shift marked a quiet, yet decisive turning point. Bardot was no longer wrestling only with roles, but with an entire system that had learned to see her as a phenomenon rather than a human being. That shift did not bring silence. On the contrary, starting in 1964, Bardot's pace of work intensified until there was almost no space left to breathe. Projects followed one another along a trajectory already set, where her mere presence could guarantee box office long before the script had a chance to ask any meaningful questions. Viva Maria! In 1965, her collaboration with Louis Malle became an unmistakable commercial high point. The film was widely embraced in Europe and Latin America, reinforcing Bardot's position as a name capable of pulling global audiences. Yet even within that structure of constant production, her bond with the work began to loosen. Characters were no longer places to hide or to test new terrain. They functioned instead as familiar variations of an image the market already knew how to sell. Around the same time, Bardot appeared in 2 weeks in September, The Night Heaven Fell, and multiple other projects at an intensity that turned cinema from a creative space into something closer to an assembly line. Commercial success continued, and the press began measuring her influence in numbers, comparing the revenue generated by the name Bardot to the scale of entire national industries. Her image flooded magazines, posters, advertisements. Every appearance was translated into economic value. At this point, Bardot was no longer merely a star. She had become a self-contained brand, consistently profitable and endlessly exploited. In parallel, music opened up as another branch of activity, but not as a form of liberation. Recording and collaborating with Serge Gainsbourg brought Bardot's voice, breath, and fragility into the public sphere in a new way, yet it was quickly absorbed into the same mechanism of consumption. Songs spread rapidly, her image multiplied, and Bardot remained trapped at the center of a machine that would not allow her to slow down. The layers of activity did not produce richer experience. They compressed time, feeling, and presence into a single profit-driven logic. At that height, the space to breathe nearly disappeared. Bardot worked like a fully functioning industry, where body, voice, and image were all mobilized at maximum capacity. Success no longer meant a sense of control. It became the pressure of maintaining speed. Her career reached a rare level of saturation, but that very saturation narrowed every possible choice, pushing Bardot into a quiet crisis, working endlessly, appearing everywhere, yet growing further and further from any feeling of connection to the very thing that had placed her at the top. That intensity continued to push Bardot onto a different trajectory from 1967 onward, one in which cinema increasingly centered on the performance of the body rather than the exploration of inner life. Frames became smoother, easier to consume, and her presence was used as a market guarantee instead of a creative anchor. Bardot began to realize she was being operated like a finished product. Appear, trigger attention, then withdraw to make room for the next cycle. The feeling of being drained of all function made her respond in a quiet but decisive way. She reduced her participation in promotion, avoided press conferences, and narrowed her contact with the media. The number of films did not decrease, but the connection between work and personal meaning dissolved, leaving an emptiness that grew sharper inside her experience of the profession. This downward slide did not happen through a sudden break, but through accumulated exhaustion. From 1967 to 1969, Bardot continued working, yet much of her creative energy had already retreated. On set, safe choices repeated themselves. In the eyes of the press, every question narrowed into one point. Could she still maintain the image that had once created the legend? The quality of roles was no longer the measure. Her body became the unit of evaluation. That mismatch produced prolonged fatigue, deepening depression, and self-destructive behavior appearing as a temporary way to numb the pressure. Alcohol became a short-term escape, and belief in cinema eroded piece by piece. By 1969, Bardot began shrinking her orbit with intention. Chaleco and Les Pétroleuses marked some of the last efforts within a system that no longer fit. Box office results were average, her influence declined, and the public response grew faint. Continuing to act now ran more on inertia than on choice, as if the work could keep moving without requiring the full presence of the person at its center. By 1971, the pace slowed noticeably. By 1973, the decision to leave cinema was made without fanfare. It was not the collapse of fame, but a conscious withdrawal from a structure that had taken too much and no longer returned anything that could still be called living. That withdrawal closed with Don Juan, or If Don Juan were a woman in 1973, Bardot's final film. There was no summation atmosphere, no staging as a farewell, no ambition to repair her image or cling to the glow. The role was carried out in a state of near detachment. Bardot appeared, finished the work, and stepped out of the frame without leaving any trace of a prepared goodbye. Soon after, she announced she was stopping completely, without opening the door to a return, without leaving the public a final project to satisfy curiosity. What made this decision unusual was not the film itself, but the way it ended a trajectory that had once reached a rare peak. Bardot left while her name could still generate profit, while her image could still draw audiences, while the market had not turned away. There was no media scandal forcing her to vanish, no disastrous fall to explain the retreat. It happened in silence, an act of severing rather than redirecting, refusing the two familiar options offered to stars. Either keep being consumed or reinvent oneself into a new, more acceptable model. In that way, Bardot walked away from cinema without negotiating further with the market, without turning her withdrawal into yet another performance. It was a rare decision in star history, closing the door while the summit was still visible, and refusing to continue existing as an image that had to be maintained, explained, or endlessly renewed for others. The silence Bardot chose after Don Juan cannot be separated from the relationship that laid the very first stone of her entire trajectory. Before she became a global phenomenon, before cinema even knew how to name what made her different, Roger Vadim appeared as the first man to recognize something in Brigitte Bardot that was both fragile and dangerous. They met in the early 1950s when Bardot was still a teenage girl tentatively stepping out of a strict family mold, and Vadim was a young assistant director, intelligent, ambitious, and unusually sensitive to the new cultural currents beginning to rise. In that relationship, Vadim was not only a lover, he became a guide, a translator of the outside world, someone who gave Bardot the rare sensation of being seen through a gaze that was not purely discipline. They married in 1952, when Bardot was only 18. On paper, it was an early union. In reality, it was the joining of a girl who had not yet fully formed a self, with a man already ready to use cinema to shape the image of the woman beside him. Vadim opened the door for Bardot into the world of film sets, but he was also the one who placed her into the position of an icon being constructed. Adieu. Créa à la Femme did not merely put Bardot on the world map, it also restructured the power dynamic between them. The explosion of success quickly threw their marriage out of rhythm. Bardot was pulled into the machinery of fame, while Vadim shifted from protector to witness, watching an image grow beyond the control of both of them. During their years together, they had no children, but pressure from work and public attention seeped into every private moment. Bardot was watched constantly, and the marriage slowly became an unsafe space, where intimacy was eroded by schedules, by outside eyes, by overlapping relationships born around the film world. Vadim continued pursuing his career while Bardot carried the weight of an image that did not allow weakness. The distance widened, not through one dramatic rupture, but through a steadily growing feeling. She was no longer sheltered inside the very relationship that had once promised freedom. Their divorce in 1957 closed that first chapter, leaving Bardot with more than a separation. It was the first time she experienced a relationship that served both as a launchpad and as a source of prolonged injury. The breakup did not erase Vadim's influence. It carved a deep trace into how Bardot understood love, control, and herself amid forces larger than any individual. What began as liberation gradually revealed itself as a repeating pattern. She would enter the light alongside a man, then slowly lose her private space, as that light became too blinding to survive. Before the crack left by that first marriage had time to close, Jacques Charrier entered Bardot's life as a completely different opposite. They met in the late 1950s, at a time when Bardot had already become a face hunted across Europe, while Charrier was a young actor marked by calmness and privacy, without the hunger for display. The initial attraction did not come from glamour, but from something rarer, a sense of normalcy. Charrier did not look at Bardot as a phenomenon. He did not try to direct her image, did not attempt to explain her to the world. In that moment, Bardot saw the possibility of retreating into a private life, of being loved without having to perform. They married in 1959, at the moment her fame was at its most uncontrollable. This marriage immediately carried a different expectation: stability, family, an escape from constant consumption. When Nicolas Jacques Charrier was born in 1960, that moment did not arrive as the natural continuation of happiness. Postpartum depression struck fast and deep. Bardot stepped into motherhood with a mind already worn down by years of being consumed as an image. The body that had belonged to the public gaze now became unfamiliar territory. No longer responsive, no longer offering connection. The sense of betrayal did not come from the man or the outside world, but from her own body, once her only surviving instrument in a world that had swallowed her whole. In that state, self-destructive behavior appeared, including a suicide attempt, not as theatrical gesture, but as the desperate symptom of a person who could no longer locate herself inside the life unfolding around her. Society did not look at Bardot with compassion during this period. The media did not approach her as a woman collapsing under a postpartum psychological crisis. Instead, it placed her in the role of a failed moral symbol. The woman once held up as freedom was reread as someone who had not fulfilled her duty. That judgment was not always loud, but it was relentless, covering every gesture she made with a cold layer of interpretation. Bardot did not only lose control of her professional image, she lost even the right to be weak as an ordinary human being. Her marriage to Charrier slowly emptied out under an incompatibility that could not be repaired. The desire for a quiet, orderly family collided directly with Bardot's increasingly fragile mental state, while the pace of work and the surveillance of the public never slowed. The divorce, in 1962, closed that attempt at building a private life and left Nicolas with his father. That decision was not merely a legal arrangement. It opened a distance that would last for decades between mother and son. A distance fed by silence, interruption, and the enduring sense of abandonment that was never fully explained. Nicolas grew up away from Bardot, inside a fractured relationship where every reunion carried the weight of the years she had not been there. When Bardot published her memoir many years later, her blunt honesty about motherhood, about personal failures and irreversible choices, did not become an act of healing. For Nicolas, it felt like another violation, private life dragged back into public space. The lawsuit her son filed against her marked more than a legal rupture. It exposed the deepest tragedy of Bardot's life, the irreparable loss of the mother-son bond, existing alongside a public image that continued to be celebrated as an icon of freedom. The void left behind after Bardot's marriage to Jacques Charrier had barely settled when Gunter Sachs appeared, like an entirely different universe. They met in the mid-1960s, inside the world of international parties, where money, art, and spectacle blended into a language of their own. Sachs was a German millionaire, heir to an industrial empire, and also a photographer and notorious playboy of Europe's upper class. With him, Bardot did not encounter a man trying to shape her, nor one demanding family life, according to tradition. What drew her in was the sense of release, the feeling of living in a world where nothing seemed to require explanation. From the beginning, Sachs's pursuit was theatrical. Extravagant gestures, sudden trips, and his eagerness to place Bardot at the center of a glittering orbit created the illusion of a life without pressure. The marriage came in 1966, fast, radiant, and sharply opposed to the tense years that had preceded it. There were no children, no intention of building a family in the conventional sense. Their life together revolved around travel, parties, and a surface freedom they both accepted. But inside that glamour, another feeling slowly surfaced. Wealth did not bring the safety Bardot had been searching for. It merely replaced pressure with emptiness. Sachs adored Bardot's image, elevating her as a living icon. Yet that elevation continued to place her in the position of being displayed, this time not by cinema or the press, but by an upper-class world operating through a subtler logic of possession. Bardot moved through luxurious spaces, admired and indulged, yet grew increasingly distant from any sense of inner connection. The conflict did not erupt in dramatic arguments. It unfolded in prolonged silence, in distances covered up by comfort. Sachs's life rhythm continued to revolve around society, while Bardot began to withdraw, feeling she was living inside yet another role, more beautiful, but no less foreign. The marriage ended in 1969, without scandal, without a loud collapse, only the slow dissolution of an illusion, that freedom could be purchased through luxury. That separation left a different mark on Bardot's emotional journey, the realization that neither control nor extreme indulgence could free her from the feeling of being owned. After Sachs, the idea of love tied to glamour lost its pull, replaced by a growing need that became increasingly clear: to retreat from any structure that placed her at the center, regardless of how that centrality was achieved. After breakups overexposed by fame and money, Bernard Dormal entered Brigitte Bardot's life in a completely different rhythm. They met in the late 1980s, when Bardot had already withdrawn from cinema and nearly sealed off every door to the outside world. Dormal was not from the arts, carried no aura of celebrity, and did not approach Bardot as a symbol to be conquered. He was a discreet businessman with conservative political views, appearing within the private space where Bardot was attempting to rebuild herself after years of exhaustion. The relationship formed slowly, without explosive passion or showy gestures. What Bardot found in Dormal was absolute stability. A man who did not require her to appear, did not demand public desirability, and did not turn her presence into a story for others to consume. They married in 1992, quietly, almost detached from the media. There were no children, no ambition to expand a family. Their life together revolved around la madrague, repeating routines, and the animal world into which Bardot increasingly poured all her energy. Within this marital structure, Bardot no longer had to reshape herself to fit society's expectations of a wife. Dormal accepted a woman who had stepped away from the center, carrying old wounds and an increasingly hardened way of seeing the world. The tensions did not take the form of emotional explosions. They existed as differences in worldview, especially as Bardot grew more extreme in her opinions and life choices. Dormal remained in the role of protector of that private life, accepting the background, accepting silence, accepting Bardot's lead in shaping the tempo of the life she needed. This marriage did not carry romance in the familiar sense, nor did it heal the old fractures. It created a space private enough that Bardot no longer had to defend herself against the outside gaze, quiet enough for her to maintain a life that did not require proof. In that relationship, Bardot was not searching for redemption or compensation for the past. She was holding on to one thing she had lost very early on: the right to exist without being watched. The withdrawal Bardot made in 1973 was not a symbolic ending. It was the way she learned to remain still inside a life she fought to take back for herself. From Saint-Tropez, where she closed the door on cinema and on the public, time began to move by a different rhythm, slower, repetitive, and not meant to be witnessed. The image that once unsettled the world gradually disappeared from the cycles of praise, making room for a person who lived privately, defensively, pouring her energy into beings weaker than herself. As Bardot aged, her presence no longer belonged to the frame, but to the endurance of a choice she never reversed for more than half a century. On December 28, 2025, Brigitte Bardot died at her home in southern France, ending a life the public gaze never completely released, even after she turned her back on it. Her passing came quietly, faithful to the way she had chosen to exist for a long time. No stage, no choreographed farewell, no attempt to control how the world would remember her. The news spread quickly, bringing with it tributes, familiar labels, and the same old interpretive frames that had clung to her name for decades. Yet beneath that layer of language was something harder to name. A hollow space where even the symbol was finally no longer there to carry the weight. Bardot's legacy does not fit neatly inside filmography or easily recognizable cultural milestones. It lives in the rupture she forced into cinema when the female body appeared, perhaps for the first time, as an entity that did not ask permission, did not soften itself to please the system. It lives in the paradox of a woman celebrated as liberation who spent her life in a state of being consumed. And it lives in her absolute withdrawal, an act so rare that it remains almost unmatched, a symbol refusing to continue existing in any market-friendly recycled form. When Bardot died, the questions surrounding her did not close. They remained quiet, persistent, about the price of being watched for too long, about bodily freedom once it no longer belongs to the individual, about whether it is possible to escape the image one helped create. What remains is not a tidy conclusion, but a long trail of influence, where cinema, culture, and private life collide in tension that cannot be untied. And within that trail, Brigitte Bardot is present as she lived, without permission, without explanation, without turning back. What made Brigitte Bardot different was not that she was once the most desired woman of the century, but that she refused to live her entire life in that position. Bardot understood the power of the image, understood the cost of a body seized by the collective gaze, and understood the loneliness born from being adored too much without ever being touched as a human being. She walked through fame with a rough survival instinct, sometimes extreme, sometimes controversial, yet consistent in one thing. She would not keep pleasing the world if the price was losing herself. When people speak of Bardot today, they do not remember only Juliette Hardy, the tangled blonde hair in the Saint-Tropez wind, or the frames that changed how cinema looks at women. What lingers longer is a question never fully resolved. Does a woman have the right to withdraw from the role society imposes on her? Bardot did not offer an explanation. She did not try to reconcile her image with the morality of her time. She did not ask to be understood. She chose silence, chose to stand slightly off-center, chose a life whose value was no longer measured by appearance. That choice made Bardot uncomfortable, hard to love, impossible to unify into a single version, and precisely for that reason, impossible to replace. If Brigitte Bardot ever confused you, unsettled you, made you admire her or feel the ache of something unresolved, leave a line for the woman who dared to step out of the role the entire world wanted to keep her trapped in. And if you want to keep listening to the complicated lives behind familiar icons, staying with us, sharing, and supporting the channel is the way stories like this don't get flattened by time.